Alan Dettlaff began his career in the child welfare family policing system. He worked as a caseworker and an administrator. That's why today his work focuses on ending the harm that system causes. In 2020, Alan helped create and launch the upEND movement, a collaborative effort dedicated to abolishing the family policing system and building alternatives. Alan is the author of the forthcoming book, I can't wait to read, Racist Intents, American Child Welfare in the Afterlife of Slavery and the Case for Abolition. He's also co-founding editor of the Abolitionist Perspectives Journal. Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work Journal, a peer-reviewed scholarly journal dedicated to developing and disseminating an abolitionist praxis in social work. Alan is still at the University of Houston. He teaches foundations in abolitionist social work, a course I would have loved to have taken many years ago. I didn't have that option. And Alan was also, up until recently, Dean of Social Work at University of Houston. And I say up until recently because they did something that I was very open about. It was very stupid. I had wanted to have Alan on prior to this, but this poor choice makes this interview even more important. It's critical that we understand what happened, why it happened, who Alan is, and why this is not good news for any of us or the movement to abolish the family policing system or carceral punishment and mass criminalization nationwide. If you may have not realized, this is the Awkward Interviews, and I am really excited to have my friend Alan Dettlaff here. Alan, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here. Glad we were able to make this work.
Yeah, me too. I'm sorry my life has been so insane, as some others may also have witnessed over the last few months, but I'm not alone in that way. So tell me what the heck happened and what are we doing about it?
Yeah, so I've been dean here at the university, or had been dean here at the University of Houston since 2015. This was my 8th year as dean. And since really around since I began, I've led this college with a really strong emphasis on racial justice. We've had a lot of racial justice programming over the years. As social workers, we as a college adopted a broad mission to work to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice early in my time as dean. But then, as Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, we saw more and more videotaped incidences of police violence against the Black community. The riots in Charlottesville, we really took a strong stance towards being a college that would really stand for and prepare our students to stand for racial justice. Around 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the defund the police movement, we really started to lean into that and what I believe is social workers' ethical responsibility to work towards the abolition of systems. Our code of ethics as social workers says that social workers must, and this is the only place in the code of ethics that uses the word must, social workers must take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. That means that social workers must take action against the systems that are responsible for perpetuating racism, discrimination, oppression, and inequities. So we've had a strong abolitionist lens since 2020. As you mentioned, I co-founded the upEND movement, which is a movement specifically looking at the child welfare family policing system. I knew there was some resistance on our faculty. Abolition, as I know you know, and I know a lot of people listening know, it's a difficult concept when you initially hear about it to understand what all it entails, particularly that it's much more about building up than it is about tearing down. But we've been in a process of educating ourselves about that over the past couple of years. Last month, December 13th, I was told by my provost that I had lost the confidence of 4 full professors in my college because of my abolitionist views, and he was removing me from my post as dean because of that. Some of the specifics: I had a couple of years ago made the decision to no longer place students for their internships in police departments or prisons or jails, district attorney's office, anything having to do with the criminal punishment system. These professors said that had harmed our relationship in the community. I don't have any evidence of that, but that's their view. they said that essentially what was disappointing to me is they said that I had created an environment where if you're not an abolitionist, then you're a racist. That's certainly not something that I said, but I think it's, says something that's the way that they perceived the work. And so because of that, because of the damage that they felt that this had done to their work and to the college, I was removed as dean.
Okay. So before we get into if we're gonna fight that, let's just talk a little bit about it happening in the first place. My mom was a social worker. She was an activist, but I don't think that she, when she went to school, even had the opportunity to think about things the way that your students have. And it was one of the things that I found, because my mom would have loved it too, it's one of those things that attracted me the most to what you were doing. I haven't really worked with or interviewed or been interviewed by that many social workers, which is funny because you would think, since a lot of what I do is suggesting replacing things with social workers, that I would have more, right? And so that's again why this was so important for me to speak with you, and also why what happened to you is so important. I think it's such an interesting idea that that they would say it damaged relations with the community. They don't mean with the community of people, they mean with the community of oppressors. Which is, inherently that says it all there, right? Even if they didn't absurdly call you a racist. Then there's also your interesting choice not to send anyone to carceral systems or send them, to a role within that, right? And I don't know if that was a good or a bad choice, actually, but I will give you some background. Two of the experiences that I had that most pushed me toward where I am was witnessing that, of actually being there. So in a way, they might have been even worse off had you let your students who were learning from you get into these places, right? Because when I was in Greenhaven for a couple years, I knew exactly why I didn't want to end up there permanently. And I knew exactly why they didn't want me in there talking to the incarcerated people. And I also got to see firsthand so many of the horrible things that the public should be afraid of the COs, not the people they've locked away. And then when I thought I was doing the right thing and I went to and got a grant to work at an alternative to incarceration center, carceral as fuck. So, again, I know exactly why you did that. But I think it would have been even worse for them, because all you have to do is witness it to know, which is why anyone who's directly impacted by the system knows to stay as far away from police as possible. So anyway, those were just my initial thoughts. If it isn't clear, I think it's not only especially after so long with you being in that position, especially the way they did it, what they said to you, it was wrong. It was clearly wrong, and it was also a mistake. It was also a mistake for them. They, in my opinion, and that of many people like me, and I believe we are leading the conversation. We are the future of this conversation. We don't look at UH the way we used to, right? And I don't want you there anymore. I want you to be a professor at a school that I love. Anyway, what are we doing? I know I signed something. I know I said I'm pissed, but that's not going to change anything. So more directly, I believe there's a movement to make something of this, whether it's just to publicize it and make sure everyone knows, or if you're interested in being put back in that position. I'm not even sure. So where are we now with that?
Yeah, it's not about being put back in the position. It's about making a statement, really, that abolitionist work, abolitionist practice is a valid form of academic inquiry that schools, not just schools of social work, but all educational institutions should be studying. You know, the worst case scenario of this is that people see what happened to me and then they're afraid to talk about abolitionist work. They're afraid that they'll be punished somehow, that a new PhD student who's studying abolition, who's up and coming, wants to be a professor and doing abolitionist work is going to think they have to stop because of what happened to me. That's what this movement is about, putting a stop to. So there's an open letter that people can sign on to from the the Network to Advance Abolitionist Social Work, calling on the University of Houston to commit to maintaining its abolitionist focus in the Graduate College of Social Work, but also to some other national social work organizations, the National Association of Deans and Directors of Social Work Programs, National Association of Social Workers, the Council on Social Work Education, to say that abolitionist inquiry is an important form of education that all social workers should be learning about, understanding, because of our values. These are conversations we should be having in the classroom, and they need to continue. That's what we're fighting for now.
You know, very professional when you mute yourself as the interviewer, right? Moving on. I love that. That's what I said when you couldn't hear me. I love that, and and where can people go to add their names? What can people do to help?
Yeah, the letter, there's a Medium link. I could share it with you, so you could share it with your listeners. You know, if you follow me on Twitter, you can look at my Twitter page and it's right there. But this is really about sending a message. But I think, you know, two parts. One to the University of Houston, which I think is really important. We have students come here from all over the country specifically because of our abolitionist focus. And I want the university to understand that that needs to stay in place. But then broadly, I think it's important for academics or people who outside of academia, but to say to academics, this is the kind of work that needs to continue.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had a great education. I got my degree in sociology, and years later, 20 years later, one of my professors, one of my favorite professors, co-signed 10 Demands, the abolitionist organization we created, and I should say she co-signed the 10 Demands for Justice, which were, you know, the 10 demands we created to set us on the path toward abolition. Which, you know, not long after that, you co-signed as well. And we certainly co-sign your work. And so not only is it critical for abolitionist thought to be introduced in institutions of higher learning, so that I wouldn't have had to do all that learning on my own. It's part of abolitionist praxis for social workers to be directly involved actually in their communities, not teaching students who may live in the communities where police are a priority. No, the social workers are parts of their community, unlike the police who come from other neighborhoods and impose upon. Tell me more about that. How do you see the role of the social worker in a more humanist, non-carceral society?
Yeah, and you know, that's, you know, social workers' responsibility is to enhance their client's well-being, whether that their client is an individual, a family, a community, a neighborhood. And social workers really have what I think of as a dual responsibility to address the needs of the individuals, the families, communities they're working with, but also then to address the larger injustices in society that create the need for social workers in the first place, that create the conditions of poverty and houselessness and unemployment, mass incarceration that so many people experience. But in order for social workers to do that, social workers have to establish a helping relationship relationship and a trusting relationship with the communities that they're working with, which is why I stand by the decision to not place social work students with police. You know, when the defund movement began in 2020, social work was kind of thrust into this conversation as a potential solution to some of the problems with policing. And I do think that social workers can replace some aspects of policing, not link up with police, though, to help them in their jobs. That's what a lot of people initially called for, and that's the problem. If social workers want to establish a helping relationship with a community, they can't walk into that community arm in arm with the very people who are oppressing them and brutalizing them, which is the police. We have to distance ourselves from the police and say, you know, we've tried to create change from the inside. We've tried to work on reforms. We've tried to do different trainings, things like that. They don't work. And at this point, continued collaboration is just complicity. We have to completely get out of policing and work with communities, in communities, completely devoid from the police.
Oh, I absolutely love that. And I'm glad you clarified too. When I was younger and I made my way into these different places, these carceral, I guess, what would you call them? There's a carceral system, and these are carceral spokes to it or something, but whatever. When I went and did that, you made me rethink my original thought. I wasn't going to participate, right? Like the way you just explained it, the idea of your students going on ride-alongs with cops to work alongside them. Yeah. Not a good idea. Very much not what anyone wants. I was just thrown into the office. That's what they wanted. And I spent as much time as I could spying and learning. But the reason I got fired from the grant, I wasn't even really hired by them. They kicked me out because I got too close, right? Because I was actually listening to them and helping them and they were improving on their GED scores. You know, anyway, 100%. And that's the way that these types of conversations get so misconstrued, right? And like, what does it mean? What does defund mean? What does abolish mean? For people like you and I should say, for people like you and me, we know what it means. We know what it means to us. We know what it means historically. But the vast majority of people in public still don't, which leaves so much opportunity to create situations like what happened to you at your university. They, use people's misunderstanding, lack of information, etc., to push us further back. Right. And of course, propaganda is something I talk about all the time. That's the main mechanism of just constant disinformation. What do we do? How do we counteract that? In addition to not just letting things like what happened to you happen and moving on, raising our voices, making sure that they're heard. What do you think we can do in our own communities? How can we start knowing that it might be a while to create alternatives so that when we say F the police, we mean like not just F the police, or we're going to call them anyway, but like we really don't need them now.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about education, not just education in formal settings like I work in, but to education in informal settings with our neighbors, community members about what abolition work is really about. Particularly, I think of abolition as really just a theory of change. Abolition is a theory of anapraxis about how we can bring about a society where there is greater equality, greater justice, really true liberation. And when you really think about it, when I was doing research for the book that you mentioned that's coming out later this fall, I realized even going back to the original abolition movement, people like Frederick Douglass, some of the original abolitionists, after slavery was ended, denounced the movement because it had stopped. the original goals of abolition, which is really freedom and liberation for Black Americans, was never fulfilled in the original abolition movement. And that's what we continue to fight for today. That's what abolition is about. But then, so educating people that it's really about creating a new society where people have everything they need to thrive, and there really is justice and equality. But also, you know, I think there's places to educate people on some of the smaller aspects of the systems that we're trying to end. When I think about my own work in the child welfare family policing system, I try to educate people on the facts that up to 70% of children who are in foster care because of what the state calls neglect, which is largely associated with poverty. You know, most people don't realize that. Most people think we need this child welfare, child protective system because it's helping children who are being harmed. Only 17% of kids in foster care are in foster care because of physical or sexual abuse. Most of the kids in foster care are there because of poverty. So what we have is a system that takes children away from their parents because they're poor, and then puts them in a home with a stranger, and then pays that stranger money to take care of someone else's children when all their parents need is money. It's ridiculous, but most people don't understand that that's what the system is doing, and the system is doing that disproportionately to Black children and families. You know, so partly it's about education about what the systems are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's two-sided, and I do it the same way. You know, you have to make sure they understand how bad it really is,
right,
to show them how good it really can be.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the way we talk, they don't believe it, right? Like, am I crazy, or did you just describe a utopia? Right? But guess what? None of us believe in our utopia that there will be no mistakes, that there will be no affronts, you know, upon an individual, that people won't have disagreements. That is not what we're saying. And in fact, if you think it sounds crazy, just imagine us taking all the money that goes to the cops, corrections, the Pentagon, etc., and putting it maybe in the homes of the people whose children they are in the first place. So, you know, so they don't have to make someone else rich by having 30 kids in their house, who aren't theirs. It's actually not that crazy, right? So a lot of it is like dispelling myths too.
Yeah, and it's not that children won't be harmed. You know, it's about creating a society where we respond to harm in ways that don't cause further harm, which is what family separation does now. You know, during the Trump administration in 2018, during the zero tolerance policies, everyone started to understand how harmful family separation is when we saw it happening at the US-Mexico border. That same harm that we saw happening at the border is the harm that's happening every day in neighborhoods across the country. You know, during the whole zero tolerance policy, about 3,000 children were separated from their families. The child welfare family policing system removes more than 3,000 children from their parents weekly in the United States, up to 250,000 children every year. What we're talking about, I think, you know, people always ask me, well, if there's no child welfare system, what will happen to the children who are being harmed? And, you know, the best way I've come to answer that is to think about your own family. Think about your family, the network of people that you love and care about. Imagine a child is harmed in that family. What would you want to happen? Would you want to get together as a family, as a community of people who love and care each other, and figure out what's going to happen to protect this child? Or would you want the government to come take the child away from you and figure it out for you? I think most people would want the first option, right? And if you want that for you and your family, then you should want that for every family. And that's abolition. It's not a utopia. It's about families and communities making decisions, having the power to make decisions for themselves, and then having the resources to be able to provide whatever supports are necessary to prevent further harm from happening.
All right. I love that answer, but you didn't answer me.
What was the question?
Hold on. It was a great answer, because you answered another question I always love to ask that leads us to the nitpicking I'm going to force you to do. You talked about what an abolitionist, what abolition really is, what abolition means to you, what abolition looks like. And yes, so in a way, you answered the question, which is, what can we do in our community? And so when it comes to families, yes, what we would all want to do is not remove the kid and never see the kid again. And we all know that the kid wouldn't want that either. So this is clearly a class and race thing. You know, the rich white family, that's just not happening. Even if the dad beats the kid or whatever it is, it's just not. They're going to find some other solution. Just like when white people do drugs or sell drugs more often than Black people do, and they're not the ones in prison. So anyway, yeah, you are 100% right on that. And so to clarify for everyone even further that it's not a utopia, because yes, you acknowledged there will be harms, right? It's how we reduce the amount of harms, through preemptive work, and how we respond the right way if they happen or when they happen. What can the average person, though, who isn't a social worker, what can your average mom or average bus driver or bodega owner, or yeah, I mean, what can someone in their community who isn't trained, who isn't educated to do specific work, how can they begin to create for themselves the kind of community that we all know we want, and would be able, because again, we need really now more than anything is to add on to this tapestry of data research that we have demonstrating that the alternatives work. But we need to be able to get those alternatives in there to show it. So how do we start doing that in communities? If your community doesn't have community defense, if your community doesn't have mutual aid, if no one's watching the cops or watching the courts, maybe I just gave the answers away, but what can you as an individual do? What do you, Alan, recommend people do first and foremost, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like you said, I mean, looking into and developing mutual aid networks, I think is the biggest way to bring about change. Recognize that some education of yourselves, I think, is important. A lot of what all of the propaganda, all of the propaganda that the child welfare family policing system perpetuates is this idea of individual pathology, that people are responsible for their own poverty, their own situations that they're in, without recognizing that these are governmental problems that have specific policy solutions. The government could decide to end poverty if it wanted to, and it chooses not to, and it chooses to blame individuals for it. So recognizing that people aren't poor because of individual pathology, problems within themselves, but because of societal things, and then starting these mutual aid kind of networks to address some of that. A part of that too is then calling on your politicians. Not that I'm necessarily a fan of electoral politics, but given the current system that we have now, there are things that can be done to address some of the poverty issues that lead to people becoming involved in the family policing system and coming to the attention of cops. But then really specifically to family policing, what I would want people to know is to really educate yourselves about the harms of mandatory reporting, and to not fall victim to that. Mandatory reporting laws are written in ways that are incredibly vague and encourage people to report people to these child abuse hotlines for the smallest little thing. You see a child who's hungry, you see a child who's wearing dirty clothes, you see a family who's homeless, and you think you're going to help them if you call a child abuse hotline. You're not going to help them. You're going to cause immense harm. There are things that you can do. Refer that family to the food bank. Refer that family to a social work network. Don't call mandatory reporting laws. That's what gets families caught up in the system and ultimately gets their children taken from them.
Yeah, very important point. And all really great points. And listen, I also the 21st century John Brown also is understanding of the necessity of politics today, right? I have no interest in the federal government really, but there are other ways that you didn't even mention, honestly, where local politics can be really important. And it's as simple as like the city council you elect is there whether, well, the city council is there whether you like it or not. So you can either engage and elect people who are going to defund the police, or you can elect people who are going to increase police spending. You know, and so it's as simple as that. But that's not all, right? That's not all you can do. The mutual aid stuff is critical. And if you are not interested in being out there in the cold on the side of the street, you can certainly donate resources, you can donate money, you can donate time in other ways. You can make connections for people. That's one thing that rich white people have a lot of, is connections, and that's something that no one else does. So take advantage of that for something positive. You mentioned propaganda, and we've mentioned it a few times as being a critical way that we are misinformed and, you know, causing us to make these poor choices, like calling social services on families. So I'm very thankful to say that every once in a really, every 2 blue moons, something positive does end up on TV. So CBS just did that, right? Am I crazy, or was there something on the family policing system on CBS?
Yeah, there was a CBS Sunday morning show. It aired on December 4th. Erin Moriarty was the reporter and did a really fantastic job of tracking 2 families, 2 Black mothers whose children were taken from them. And again, like to highlight how horrible this system is. One of these children were taken from their mom because she wandered away while they were at a picnic in the park, and it took the mom a little bit to find her daughter. Someone found out about this and reported her. Another mom is something that happens all the time. Mom left her young daughter at home because she had to go to work and she couldn't afford daycare. Someone found out that the child was at home alone and called a child abuse hotline. That child was taken away from the mom. In neither of these instances were the children harmed in any way, but in both of those instances, those children were taken away from their mothers because of what the system calls neglect. So this CBS Sunday morning show did a really good job of highlighting how the system sets people up for failure. And the part that I talked about is, and I don't think people realize this, once your child is involved in the system, how difficult it is to get your child back and how enormous the hoops are to jump through. You know, what this show talked about, these children were taken away from their moms. Then they have to go to parenting classes and to anger management classes, psychological evaluations. They have to get regular drug tests. And all the while, there's no empathy or understanding on the part of the system that these are moms who are already living in poverty. And then they're expected to go do all of these things, most of which are during the daytime. And I think back when I used to work for this system, and I would hear caseworkers say to moms, a mom would say, I can't take all this time off work. I'm going to get fired from my job if you make me keep going to all these appointments. The caseworker would say, well, this is about your child. You need to figure it out. This needs to be your priority. Again, no understanding of the challenges of how difficult it is to do that. But that's what this system is. I mean, that's how the system really harms families. So yeah, having that on CBS Sunday morning was really big for this movement.
And also, I brought it up, not to herald CBS, because it'll be a while before they do something like this again. The point was that if you don't believe us, if somehow some crazy abolitionist in your family sent this conversation to you and you think we're nuts, we just said CBS. This is mainstream corporate media, okay? So it's not just in these times, or it's going down, or Alan and myself, okay? And likewise, I can just hear people saying, well, they were, it's CBS. They found 2 absurd examples, but that's not what it's really like. Everyone else is beating the shit out of their kids. They're not just doing what every parent has done. It happened to me, happened to my parents. You turn around, your kid's not there. So right? Like, but it's not that. That's 1/1,000,000th of the percentage. Can we clarify what percentage is bullshit like this, and what is the horror stories we have in our brains?
Yeah, and there's actual data to support that. It's 70%, just over 70%, 70% of children who are taken away, forcibly taken away from their parents and put in foster care, are taken away from their parents because of poverty-related neglect. Things like having to leave a child home alone while you go to work because you can't afford daycare. That's what children are going into foster care for. Only 17% of kids in foster care are in foster care because of what would be considered harm, physical or sexual abuse. And really, when we think of like the really serious cases, those are probably a fraction, 0.5%. What happens, though, is when there are these really serious cases, those are the cases that are deemed newsworthy. Those are the cases like the local news covers, and you see Child Protective Services going out and responding, and that creates this myth, same with myth of what the cops cover, that this is what they're doing all the time, when it's not. They're taking kids away from their parents because they're poor, because they can't afford food, because they can't afford a place to live, because they're living out of their car. That's what CPS is taking kids away for.
Yep, absolutely. And it's no different from the sex offender registry on the total opposite end of things.
Mhm.
The percentage of people who've actually committed the crimes you think they committed,
Exactly.
minuscule. The percentage of people in prison because they're serial killers, less than 1%. Like,
Right.
it's just a matter of what we're taught, what we understand. And which is why the work that you do every day and the work that CBS did for that short period, is so incredibly important.
Mhm.
Tell me more about how you got into this from a personal level. I think it may be more common than some think, and maybe it shouldn't even be surprising that
Mhm.
people who are doing the work within the system realize how terrible it is and decide to do something different, or even the opposite, or fight that system. But I can't imagine it's incredibly common that someone goes from, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially like an officer in that world, a caseworker maybe. Okay, caseworker is a safer, fair description maybe, but in a way, as you know, it's carceral, right? So how did you end up getting into that work to begin with? I'm really curious how someone as amazing as you even found yourself doing that, and then the transition away from it.
Yeah. Well, it goes back a long time. I actually went into social work because I wanted to work for the child welfare system. I wanted to work for Child Protective Services. This is mid-90s. I'm 20-something, kind of an aimless junior college student, didn't know what I wanted to do for a career, knew I wanted to do something that helped people. And I saw a news story about a reporter who went on a ride-along with a Child Protective Services worker and realized, like, wow, that's the kind of work I could do. I could really help people. And I changed my major to social work. I did an internship with Child Protective Services, and I went to work with them right out of my undergraduate degree. This was in 1996. And I worked as a child maltreatment investigator for 6 years in that system. So I was the person responsible for investigating families and for taking their children away. And at the time, I thought that I was helping people. And that's the culture that this agency breeds. It's just, I think of it as a culture of removal. That's just what you do. You don't talk about the harm that removing children causes. You don't talk about the overrepresentation of Black people. It's just what we all did. And the way that system thinks about families is so horrific that's what increases the removal numbers. It wasn't until I left the system that I realized that the majority of children that I had taken away from their families, one, were Black or brown children. Two, really didn't need to be removed from their families if I had spent more time figuring out alternatives. But the problem is when you're in that system, you just don't talk about it. You don't talk about how harmful it is to remove children. And what I always think of, like, what I didn't realize when I was working in that system is how much children love their families and want to stay with their families. Never once, when I looked back, did a child that I took away from their parents say, "Thank you so much for removing me from my horrible abusive parent." That never happened. In fact, when I would go see children afterwards, all they wanted to know is when they were going to go home. And that is what I just didn't realize when I was in the system. So then coming to understand my own complicity in the system, how my biases impacted the decisions that I made about families, how my lack of understanding about how much children care about their parents, that's what led me into the work that I do now. And ultimately understanding, I spent probably a decade after I left the system just trying to reform the system. So I was a reformer for a long time, thinking that I could work with the system to reduce the number of kids who are being taken away from their parents or reduce the racism in the system. And ultimately got to the place where I realized it's just so deeply embedded in the system. There is no amount of reform that could ever change the system. And in fact, the system is designed in a way to be reform proof, essentially. And really the only way to end the harm of family separations is to stop separating children from their families, which is how I got into the work I do now.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's, I'm sure that there was a lot of pain probably with, witnessing these things happening and then, thinking about that, years later. But the work that you're doing now is so important. So I hope you feel really good about that. And I certainly agree with you that reform is how we got here. Reformism is how we got here. There are ways, such as some steps in the 10 demands, to chip away at the system with reform. And those are reforms that point us toward, take us a step toward abolition. Reforms that don't do that are, like you said, just strength. That is what reformism is. It is, the system is designed to absorb that and even grow with it. A great example I always use of that is Biden making this big proclamation about private federal prisons, when they are like, I think at most 11% of all people in prison. And of course, when you say that, you implicitly say that non-private prisons are right.
Absolutely.
So it actually made things worse. Plus, he also didn't do it. So there's that. But absolutely, it is built into the whole system. It is built into family policing. Certain people in certain communities are targeted. And one interaction with a police officer or the system significantly increases the likelihood of future criminality. So you're not just destroying the lives of kids and destroying families, you're also creating new criminals that you can feed your coffers with, which maybe is part of it, because more than 3,000 kids were arrested at school that we know of between 2000 and 2019. I think it was, even though Black children are 15% of public schools, they were nearly 50% of those arrested at school for things like crying, for being a Black kid and crying. One kid, a 6-year-old, was so small they couldn't use handcuffs on him, so they had to use zip ties. So this is the kind of shit that's happening in the schools as well. So it is clear, it's, to me at least, it's a war on these children. Get them in the system sooner rather than later.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's the same in the child welfare family policing system. Black children in the United States represent something about 13-14% of children in the United States, over 30% of children in foster care. In places where I live, like Houston, Black children are upwards of 60% of children who are in the foster care system, more than 3 times their population in the city. The system is designed to get these children in the system. And when you really think about it, the way that foster care is so devastating to families, and particularly to Black communities, foster care as an intervention causes so much harm from family separation and the amount of time that children are separated from their families. Children who spend time in foster care are more likely as an adult to experience poverty, unemployment, homelessness, substance use problems, incarceration, suicidal ideation, mental health problems. all of the things that maintain oppression of Black Americans in society, foster care produces. So foster care is actually an agent of oppression by over-removing, over-surveilling Black children, taking them away from their families. The system itself is causing the conditions, homelessness, incarceration, poverty, that maintain the oppression of Black Americans throughout the United States. So the system itself is causing oppression.
Beautifully said. What can someone who wants to impact this on a larger scale outside of their community, what do you recommend people do to become better informed, and to share that information?
Yeah, get involved in the upEND movement. Our website is upendmovement.org. We have a document inspired in many ways by 10 Demands and other documents that look at prisons and policing, that looks at its 7 steps towards abolition of the family policing system. We call the document How We End Up, A Future Without Family Policing, and it outlines, and it focuses on both the dismantling and the building. There's 3 steps to dismantling the system, 4 steps to building up a new society where the need for a family policing system is obsolete. And we frequently put on our website additional resources that talk about the carceral logic of the system, the harms of mandatory reporting, all of that. So, ending mandatory reporting laws is a big part of the steps towards abolition. And you mentioned reforms a minute ago. This month, we're releasing a document to help people evaluate a reform, similar to the critical resistance document that looks at reformers versus abolitionist steps. We're putting out a document this month that's going to apply family policing reforms to that. So, is this a reform that just builds up and strengthens the system, gives it more money, or is this a reform that really is a step toward abolition? So that's ways that people can educate themselves about that.
Oh man, that is fantastic. There's a lot of great groups doing great work in this space. And by this space, I mean the abolitionist space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not familiar with many groups doing the work that upEND movement is doing. And I'm not familiar with that many abolitionist groups, period, that are doing it as well as you guys are doing. And by that, I'm not just talking about, like, I don't know, things I don't know anything about, like your recruitment numbers or something like that. I'm talking about the actual work that is being produced is so valuable. And you host an annual conference. You have the most special, powerful people there. Like, if you get Angela Davis or Miriam Kaba at your event, you're doing something right. So if this strikes a nerve with you, please do check out upEND movement. Alan and everyone else there, they're doing incredible things. Also, I highly recommend you check out Alan's book when it's out. But before I let you go, Alan, tell me a little bit about the journal that you were involved in creating. It sounds really awesome, but I don't know much about it. And while this may not be as appealing to mainstream people, it might be a little more dense, perhaps, than, a one-pager. But for my audience, I suspect a lot of you guys are interested in this deeper stuff. So tell me about the journal and what we can expect to see from that.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. The journal is called Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work. It was started last fall. We're about to put out our first issue this spring. But the journal really started for academics who are doing abolitionist work that were finding that their work was routinely rejected by the mainstream social work journals. I think so. This is a way to get academic ideas in the mainstream of academia. And I know a lot of academics follow you, watch your show. Those of us who do this work, we get a lot of pushback. We get a lot of resistance. I mean, I just got removed from my job, my deanship job because of this. But academia, Academia has an important role in the abolitionist movement. It really does, because it does move certain needles. Academic papers move certain politicians. It's an important part of this work. So the journal is a place for people who are doing abolitionist academic work to have their papers published. So if you're in social work and you're doing abolitionist work, you could check us out at apswjournal.com. And like I said, we'll be publishing our first issue this spring. It's an open access peer-reviewed journal, so no paywalls ever. You can access all of the materials for free at the website.
That is awesome. I can't wait. I'm sure we're going to end up sharing some of those, maybe just the whole thing, on the, in the resources library of the 10 for Justice, 10 Demands website. I think there, it goes without saying, but maybe I'll repeat it anyway, that academia is critically important. And also there's just great potential for incredible progress and like disastrous results as well from academia. The intellectuals have a lot of power. People like me are going through these institutions, the more privileged among us, right, who can get into a college and, do that. The education I got made me significantly contributed to who I am today. Had I been less fortunate and not gone to Vassar, I might have ended up thinking, wow, my mom was wrong about all that great work she did, and end up being an embarrassment to her. I'm very thankful that she's up in heaven proud of both of us, because we do know what's real and we do know how to fix things. But it's because of people like you, and universities and colleges like you, that people like me are educated in a way that allows them to participate the right way. I was an activist long before I went to Vassar, long before I studied sociology. But what I learned, not only in my coursework, but in organizing as a student, with all types of people, that's what prepared me to be a professional change maker, if that thing exists, right? And for what it's worth, I don't earn a penny. I never figured out a way to actually make this a career. But what I do is professional in the sense that I don't just do it in a silo. I make sure that as many people as possible can see it. And that's why having people like you on my show is so important for me, because there are people who probably aren't going to go through college, who need to know this, and who are more directly impacted, who can more immediately make really important changes around them. So thank you for all of the work you do. Thank you for your time today. My guess is that this is only the beginning, and UH's mistake to kick you out, in your position, only boosted your individual position. More people probably know about you now. More people are going to read the journal. So F them. It's going to backfire.
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show. This was a big honor.
Oh, the honor's mine, Alan. I love you. Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
All right, man. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.